Hello, I am Spiro with SP Wood Art, and thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to show you a project that I've been working on for a while, only because I've had problems with it. And I'm finally happy enough with this bowl to say, hey, it's finished. And I'm just going to move on to something else. So I hope you stay with me and enjoy the show. Here is my aromatic red cedar log that I have in my shop, and it has been waxed on the end grains and not on the sides because it still has the bark, and it has been air drying for a long time and it is really nice and dry. Now I'm going to use my Rockwell jaw horse to clamp my log and cut the log in half, or actually in 3 pieces, using a reciprocating saw. You can use a bandsaw, electric chainsaw in your shop, or a handsaw. Now I want to show you why I cut the log the way I did. This particular cedar log had a pith off to one side, which I believe normally that's the case. It's very seldom that the pith is exactly in center due to wind and other natural effects on trees. And I ended up cutting the bowl in half right down the pith, and I could have completely cut the pith out, but this log isn't very big. Now the left side will be removed while I turn, and the right sides will be cut off in 2 pieces, and this part here that I'm circling is a middle cut, which is what I'll actually be using for the bowl. And I believe in general middle cuts of a log are more stable over time than end cuts. Also, you want to think about grain direction. With my simple design that I'm thinking about here for this bowl, I want the grains to gravitate up towards the top of the bowl. And that is also where I will attach my scroll chuck. And here's a shot of that, attached to a woodworm screw. So here you can see what happens when you forget that your lathe is not bolted down. Your lathe wants to walk away. That's much better now. I really should have rounded out the blank more. Next, I'm going to start turning the blank round, and I'm going to start with my 3/8 inch bowl gouge. It has a nice long handle for stability, and the tool rest is out pretty far, as you can see, and that's because there's some ghosting here where I'm actually turning the wood and you can't really see it. And I'm taking very light cuts here in the beginning because it's bouncing around a lot because it's uneven, and there's still a lot of bark on it, and I'm trying to make sure that big chunks of bark doesn't come flying off at me. And as the blank becomes a little bit more round, I'll start taking more aggressive cuts. And as always, this is just one of my methods. Oh, and I forgot to mention this earlier. You definitely want to inspect the wood, especially if you're turning a log, for any kind of imperfections or cracks or any kind of foreign objects, as in like wire or barbed wire or bullets or anything that may have been in the tree before you turn, for safety. So back to roughing out the bowl some more until it's completely round. And I'll also clean up the face of the bowl, which is the top of the bowl here. Here you can see that I stepped off to sharpen my bowl gouge. You always have to have sharp tools. Next, I'm going to mark out with my digital calipers here a spot on the bottom of the bowl for a recess for my 4-jaw scroll chuck. And I'm also determining which size jaws I will be using on the chuck based on the size of the bottom of the bowl. Then I'll use a compass to mark the recess hole. Now I'm going to use a 1/8 inch parting tool to set the depth of the recess. Then I'll finish hollowing the recess out. Next, I'll continue on sanding. I start with about 100 grit, I believe, and work my way up to a 400 grit. Now, I've decided to use a Renaissance wax finish, and to my understanding, this is a petroleum-based wax, and it goes on very easy. It dries quickly. And what's nice about it is when you touch it, it doesn't leave any fingerprint marks once it's dried. And I thought that by using just a wax finish, it can be easily maintained. And if you didn't want the wax, you can take it off easily and possibly have the cedar smell back. Now, after the wax has had a few minutes to dry, I'll take a cotton buffing wheel and buff out the wax to harden it better and spread it out evenly, and it makes it really shiny. A safety tip, you can use paper towels if you're not comfortable with using a cotton buffing wheel with the lathe running. Moving on, I will change out my chuck jaws to a smaller set to match the recess on the bowl. Now, I'm going to apologize for not having any video of coring out the inside of the bowl. I do have a few snapshots, but the video that I had taken was not viewable due to the location of the camera. So here you can see some progression. I start off with a small S curve as I got deeper into the bowl, and I used my 3/8 inch bowl gouge to core the inside of this out, and then I moved here to a longer S tool rest as the bowl got deeper. Then I'll continue on sanding, starting at 100 grit and working my way up to a 400 grit sandpaper. Then I'll continue on waxing the inside of the bowl and buffing it, and I also continue waxing and buffing the outside of the bowl to give it at least 2 coats of the wax. Now here's where I noticed I have some trouble. I ended up having some cracks on the bottom of the bowl, and I believe it's from my scroll chuck expanding out too much, and it cracked it. I made it a little bit too tight when I reversed chucked the bowl, and I tried using some super glue and sanding it a little and applying a finish again, and it just really wasn't working for me. So I wanted to redo the bottom of the bowl, plus I wanted to take the recess off, even though I'm going to lose some of the bowl height. So I remounted my bowl on my jam chuck, and I have a video of how I made this jam chuck. It's very easy if you'd like to see how I made the jam chuck. I'll start by using my round carbide cutter, and I'm just going to round off the cracks and the recess. It's also worth mentioning here, when you're doing an application with a jam chuck, you'll eventually have a small tenon left that the live center is up against, and that puts pressure against the jam chuck. So if for some reason you make that tenon too small, say on soft woods like this cedar, The pressure could blow out the side of the tenon and the bowl will just come right out in between the center and the jam chuck. So you could have a potentially dangerous situation. So for this reason, I usually make my tenons a little bit larger in diameter than I would normally like when I'm using a jam chuck. And then I'll remove the tenon later off the bottom of the bowl, off the lathe. Now, to ensure that the bowl will sit flat on a surface and not roll around, I'm using my square carbide cutter here to make the bottom of this bowl flat. Then I removed the bowl from the lathe and removed the tenon from the bowl using a flush trim saw, or my favorite Daisuke saw. Then I'm just going to sand the bottom of the bowl up to about, I think, 220 grit, because that's all I have, and then I'll sand up to 400 by hand for the rest. Now, once again, I'm going to use the Renaissance wax to wax the outside of the bowl. The inside is fine. And then I'll let that dry for a few minutes and apply another coat of wax. And then I'll let that dry for a few minutes, and then I'll bring it over to the lathe for buffing. Now, since the bowl is off the lathe, I'm going to use my buffing wheel system and do a couple of buffs. I just won't be able to do the inside of the bowl, but that's already been done on the lathe from before. And if you don't own a buffing system, that's okay. You can use a handheld drill. That'll work with a buffing wheel on it. Or you could just use a paper towel or a rag and just buff it by hand. Sometimes you can even buff the wax with a shoe brush. That'll work.